Hey guys, I'm here for another Women's Prize review, and I'm not subtle in my thumbnails intentionally so that you have an idea of what you're getting into. This is a review of Miss Burma by Charmaine Craig, and it's not going to be pretty. I've been cycling through feelings about this being named to literary long lists. At first, I was just dazed, and then sad, and I'm guessing that by the end I'm going to be a little pissed off. So I'll do my best to clearly explain why I feel the way I do. But if you're not in the mood for a negative review video, or if you read this book and enjoyed it and don't care to see it criticized, this isn't a good one for you. Let's start with the basics because there are two main things this book has going for it. The outline of the story, and let's call it the educational value for the typical Western reader. Now I'm going to take issue with that second component later, but let's lay the groundwork for now. The plot is largely based on the history of the author's own family, and it's pretty wild. We start in 1920s Burma, which is also known in some parts of the world today as Myanmar. Controversially, we learn a little bit about that name shift in here. And we open with a boy named Benny, whose family is Jewish. After a largely unsettled childhood, he meets a woman named Kin and becomes determined to marry her. And Kin is part of one of Burma's many ethnic minority groups, the Karen, who have a long history of being persecuted. We follow Benny and Kin's tumultuous marriage through this tumultuous historical period, from World War II up to 1965, during which time control of the country shifts from British imperialist forces to members of the dominant Burmese ethnic group. This shift is supported by Britain, the US, and various other Western powers because it's seen as controlling the spread of communism. And so these Burmese government leaders begin officially limiting the rights of ethnic minorities and unofficially targeting them for extermination, launching one of the world's longest running civil wars. Benny is a political figure for the Karens during this time period, and he and Kin are separated for large parts of the war. And we also follow their oldest daughter, Louisa, who's the author's mother, and who as a teenager wins the Miss Burma beauty pageant. That's a gross oversimplification of the plot and political dealings in here, but essentially the basic story is riveting and had the potential to be an immense launch pad. Give some of these ingredients to the literary greats and you could have something incredible. And generally, Western readers know very little about this country that the West has hugely impacted. So it's an opportunity to understand at least some of the outlines of 20th century Burmese history. However, this book is flagrantly incompetent on every possible level, to the point where the two potential positives I mentioned barely factor into the reading experience. So as I've done a few times before, I'm going to break it down into some categories to try to manage all the bad. Well, I just spilled my drink and was cleaning it up for the last 5 minutes. Guess I'll cut that part out. Let's start broad and get narrower as we go. So the first way this book categorically fails is as a piece of historical fiction. If you want to know how not to write historical fiction, you could benefit from reading this. Now, Craig does begin with an inherent disadvantage in that she's writing about a country where she has to establish even the most basic facts for the majority of her readers. If you're setting historical fiction in places like France, Italy, the US, or even somewhere like Russia, you're not going to have to spell too much out for your English-speaking readers. Those places are part of our cultural consciousness in a way Burma isn't. So Craig has her work cut out for her. Initially, I was letting something slide for that reason. Already on page 8, we get a graceless info dump, which she tries to cover up by the fact that Benny has just returned to Burma after spending most of his childhood in India. This is how it reads. In truth, he knew little more about Burma than what he'd learned in history classes. That the region had been settled centuries or millennia ago by a medley of tribes, that one of the tribes, the Burmans, had dominated, and that the problem their domination presented to everyone else had been solved by the British, who'd taken possession of Rangoon nearly a century before and who continued to rule by staffing their civil service and armed forces with natives. The very names of these tribes bewildered his ignorant ears. Shan, Mon, Chin, Rohingya, Kachin, Karen, parentheses. These last pronounced with the accent on the second syllable. It seemed to him. Rohingya, Kachin, Karen. We get several more of these passages of Benny doesn't know about Burma either. How about the audience learns alongside him? Not an inherently poor technique, but I became increasingly frustrated with the execution of it. In historical fiction, the reader shouldn't feel as though you're turning aside to be like, by the way, you don't know anything, so here are the characters reading you a Wikipedia page. And the characters shouldn't say things to one another that even in your readerly ignorance, you instantly sense wouldn't need to be said aloud. They're supposedly in the middle of their lives, but suddenly they've turned to the audience for a few lines of dialogue for the express purpose of including you. As the novel progresses, these historical details only become more poorly integrated, so that frequently entire paragraphs are dropped into characters' musings that, again, read like Wikipedia pages. Especially with an American later in the story, we often get things like descriptive line about the American, political passage, descriptive line, political info. And here's where we arrive at another major issue. This book self-consciously reads like history. These characters, especially the political figures, don't think about their lives spontaneously, but rather like they've already grasped the full historical significance of events before they've developed, and as though they somehow sense that their thoughts will be read in 80 years' time. And that's not how anyone actually experiences the world. Life has an immediacy to it and an unscripted quality that Craig doesn't capture. But the place where my alarm bells really started going off and where I first glimpsed what I was in for happens pretty early on, page 33. Benny and Kin's early marriage hasn't been the smoothest at this point, and we get this passage from Benny's perspective. As 1940 progressed and Kim became resplendently pregnant with his child, Benny's sense of what he didn't know about Kin and her people seemed to take on the dimension of Burma's problem. What with a warrant, and then we get a few sentences about Burma's problems. For that matter, Benny and Kin's troubles seemed to be magnified by the scale of the world's recent problems. Japan's capturing of Nanning in China, the Soviet attack on Finland, the sinking of a British destroyer by a German submarine. True, Kin continued to appear mostly secure in their marital arrangement and her life as a member of a minority, just as the British continued confidently to frequent their Rangoon clubs in their ascots and evening gowns. No. She has the character think, gee, my personal struggles have compelling parallels with the larger world events currently transpiring. The graceful way to have done this is with one of the most basic and ancient literary techniques, juxtaposition. Recap a bit of Benny's life, and then have him read the newspaper, or have him kiss Kin goodbye, get in a taxi, and then have a conversation about local and world politics with the taxi driver. It's not hard, because that's how life actually works. All this author had to do for the personal political comparison to feel organic was to record life, and then leave the reader to connect the obvious dots. But she can't do that. We see this utter lack of trust in the reader's mental faculties. In the second category, I want to highlight characters. And what's frustrating is that these characters and their relationships are inherently intriguing. The main focus is on Kin and Benny, and there are flashes of interesting observations in here. So for example, early on, Benny wonders what parts of Kin's personality are just her, and what parts of her personality and behavior are due to her culture. Was it a Karen trait, Kin's preference for the quietness he sometimes found stifling? Had she been taught never to impose, to avoid eye contact? He wasn't at all sure that her habit of refusing his offers to purchase her some tidbit, a coffee, a trinket from a stand, wasn't in fact a Karen form of modestly accepting. That's a fascinating dynamic, right? And throughout, we have these threads of anger, mistrust, intimacy, jealousy, loyalty, these big emotions playing out on a dramatic canvas. But what stunts all of this potential is the author's inability to develop these characters without constantly inserting herself, and you feel her presence on every page because she seemingly can't show emotions. She has to spell out exactly how these characters feel again and again. There's a section after Benny becomes a successful businessman, when he goes back to his old Jewish neighborhood and has a memory of his mother telling him that it was a person's responsibility to think beyond himself, to care about those less fortunate than him. And as Benny's car drives away from that neighborhood, he imagines his mother looking down on his current life and condemning his greed and cowardice. Okay, the scene is a little heavy-handed, but fine overall. But imagine how powerful it could have been if he'd gone back to the Jewish quarter, had a fleeting thought about his mother, and then as he'd been driven away, he'd blushed. Just that. and let the reader infer how ashamed and conflicted he feels, instead of being explicitly told he feels ashamed and conflicted. But the reader is never allowed to participate in this way. Effectively, you're treated like an alien who has never experienced human emotion and so can't empathize without Craig drawing you an empathy map. It is exhausting the way she inserts herself between you and these characters, over-explaining every human interaction to the point where it's blatant puppetry. These characters aren't meant to be people. They're meant to be ciphers for Craig's messages about war and belonging and hope and love, and she strives to ensure those messages are delivered, ideally as stridently as possible. When Kin signs Louisa up for the Miss Burma pageant and starts preparing her competition, we've already been told many times at this point that she feels insecure about her aging appearance in comparison to her daughter's stunning beauty. We're in Benny's perspective, and after several pages detailing Kin's obsession, he thinks something unsuitable was happening to Kin. She seemed to be alternately harassed and exalted by the vision she was intent on conjuring out of the substance, certainly not the soul, of their eldest daughter, parentheses, as though what she were conjuring were a perfected version of herself. Herself is italicized, helpfully. People, if it hadn't already been amply demonstrated in recent passages, this also happens to be Beauty Pageants 101. The mothers project onto the daughters. It hardly needs to be stated, and it's more effective for the reader if it's implied. That never stops this author. I could highlight many more examples of this, most notably scenes where Kin and Benny histrionically consider the state of their marriage point by point, but this video is already getting super long, so I'm gonna round up category number 2 here by saying that despite all their promise, these characters, with their implausible thoughts and ridiculous dialogue, end up completely hollow and supremely forgettable. The final category I'm going to mention is sentence by sentence writing. Good God, this writing is wooden. Not noticeably terrible for the most part, just mediocre. Awkward, detached, and oddly formal. There were some lines that made me laugh. That was the main source of entertainment, to be honest, and a bitter entertainment it was. But hey, you guys know the drill, let's go through some examples. A few days later, by some universal principle by which misfortunes strike more often in aggregate than in isolation, they received a letter from Johnny's young American wife. I'm sorry, I had to read that sentence a few times when I first came across it. By some universal principle by which misfortunes strike more often in aggregate than in isolation. How many smoother ways are there to convey that exact same meaning? There's a late scene where the American meets with Benny to return Benny's journal. Almost sadly, he sifted through the mess of his overcoat and brought out Benny's volume. "You should have it," he said, holding it out. Benny took the thing between his fingers, wanting to protect it from extinguishment. That's what I think when someone hands me an important paper. I want to protect this from extinguishment. Because the big word makes the sentence more dramatic. In an early section, Kin is thinking about Louisa learning to talk during the summer. To escape the heat that seemed to be rising in parallel with Louisa's powers of articulation, Kin often strolled with her down noisy Spark Street. It's not egregious, but the accumulation of these kinds of sentences leaves the language as a whole feeling painfully stilted. Those are some of my major criticisms of Miss Burma, and I would go so far as to wonder if this isn't the weakest book I've read in all my years following this prize. There are maybe a few that had even more problems, but even they reached occasional heights that this book doesn't. This was also longlisted for my country's National Book Award last year, and it's not fun to consider what this says about these awards, especially the Women's Prize, which you guys know I love so much and champion. But I don't deserve to be talked down to the way this book talked down to me for 350 pages. No reader does. Even if the judges enjoyed it, there's no possible way this was one of the best novels written by a woman in the last year, so I'm forced to conclude that a major part of its selection was the educational element. Now, I love learning new things from novels, and I find that I remember historical facts more clearly when they're tied to a fictional narrative. That's one of the reasons I read, to discover places and times that I'll never experience otherwise. But in virtually handing me this book, in a way, the judges are saying, here, This is good for you, and I don't appreciate it because you know what's good for readers? Good books. Period. It's not your job to decide which parts of my education need to be shored up. If you hand me a truly excellent book, I'll learn something from it, no matter the topic. I warned you guys I would probably end up being pissed off, and here we are. You know what the most irritating thing is? There are plenty of books published on a yearly basis that are both important and good. Maybe not all mind-blowing seminal achievements, but books that have literary merit. We don't need to sacrifice quality to recognize books that make important statements. It's nonsensical to overlook truly talented writers. And it's condescending to readers to suggest that lowering the bar is somehow for our benefit. So that's it. I'm deeply frustrated and sad that this brazenly mediocre book that is borderline contemptuous of its readers is being propped up by powerful people in the literary community. But for you guys, I would say know yourself. If you're still interested in this story and you're not really bothered about writing, maybe you're primarily a plot-based reader, you might give it a go. Other than that, I can't in any way recommend it. Look up some articles online about this author's family and call it a day. Whew, we made it. Let me know your thoughts on Miss Burma if you've read it or are planning on reading it. And I'll see you soon for another and what will hopefully be a more positive Women's Prize review. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.